everybody. Welcome to this episode of Elements to Elevate by 180 Elevate. Each month, we laser focus and dig deeper into an area of leadership by design, which we truly believe is an element to uplift our perspectives and humanity. From insights to action, the path to elevate your mind, body, and soul starts here. In today's episode about Media Now, our guest is Mauro Guillen, Dean of Cambridge Business School. An expert on global market trends, he is a sought-after leader, speaker, author, and consultant. His latest book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, is a Wall Street bestseller worldwide. Welcome, Mauro, and thank you for being on our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have an incredibly elevated background across all different functions and experiences and expertise, from monetization, digitalization, to global trends. But take us on your journey from childhood to earlier career to this guru you are now that so many folks look up to. Our audience would love to hear about your key learnings and takeaways in each phase of your journey.
Well, I was born in Spain. I think people may have already detected that I have an accent when I speak English. And I was born in a small provincial town in the 1960s, when Spain was still a developing country, at least according to the World Bank. But I was lucky to be able to go to a school where the teachers really cared. And, I had a great family that took care of me, and of course, wonderful friends. And, I did reasonably well in school. I wasn't the best in my class, but I did reasonably well. And one thing led to the other, my curiosity. And I really realized early on that I wanted to be a teacher, an academic, to do research. But, it was difficult at the time because most of the big opportunities were primarily in the United States, certainly not in Spain. But I was lucky to essentially, be taught by people who had themselves studied in the United States and then they had returned to Spain. So I've got to say that I feel I was lucky, but of course I also, took advantage of every opportunity that I saw coming my way. But good fortune certainly played an important role. So again, I think when you're born into a family where your parents really take care of the children, and you have good friends and then you have good teachers, really the sky is the limit. And of course, I realized that not everybody has that good fortune, but I certainly did. And when I came to the United States with just one or a couple of bags with my clothes, I never thought that I would be in the United States for 34 years before I moved to the UK just about a month ago to become the dean at Cambridge Judge Business School. And the thing is, the journey, of course, you have many ups and downs always. Because, an academic career is a very lonely career. You have to do research. You have to prove that as an individual, you're very good. You don't really work in teams, at least in my field. And so, you go through a lot of ups and downs. Some days you feel that you're really doing great work. Other days you feel that you're finished, that you're nobody, that you will never be anybody in your field. So a lot of ups and downs, right? Over in my case, a 35 or so year career so far. And, again, I mean, I do recognize that I was lucky at several points during my career. But then, as you know, fortune favors the prepared. So I think the lesson that I've learned is that, yes, luck plays a very important role, but you need to be prepared to take advantage of those opportunities that somehow they present themselves in life, right? If you're not prepared, then you're never going to get anywhere, even if you're lucky.
Mm-hmm. Well, someone did say, luck is a component of preparation meets opportunity. And so when you say you're lucky, it has nothing to do with just the concept of destiny purely. It has everything to do how much you prepared and what opportunities were presented. So very well said. So you came to America and you became the dean. What have you learned in terms of the biggest learnings that, actually there's so many things that you have advised folks on and gained leadership skills on. If you were to highlight top 3 or 4 learnings in your career or lifetime, what would those be?
Okay, so let me begin by quoting somebody also from Spain, whom I'm sure everybody knows, Pablo Picasso, right? Famous, of course, as a painter and sculptor. And many of your listeners will be or might be surprised if I tell you that back in the 1960s, and I quote, he said, "Computers are useless. They
Mhm.
can only give you answers." That was the quote. And, it's a very profound thought because I think the first lesson that I learned and that has served me very well in life is that it's actually far more important to ask the right questions rather than to provide answers to questions that are given to you. So I think that people who actually do well in the world are people who are able to identify the important questions. They ask the right questions. The people who can provide solutions, that's the easy part. The hard part is what is the right question to ask, right? When you think about the discovery of DNA, when you think about the Apple iPhone, it's not because the solutions were available that we got those breakthroughs in technology. It's because people asked the right question, right? Why is it that we, have this genetic code inside ourselves, and that in a way determines some of the things that we can accomplish in life or what diseases we're going to have. So they were asking the right questions, right? I think that's the first lesson. You want me to go into the second one, or you want to ask a follow up about the first one?
Uh, let's talk about all of them and then dig deepest into the one that we'll find to be the most favorable of them all.
Okay.
But let's go ahead
So
into all of them.
I think the second one that I would mention, which is very important to me, is look, we are in a world in which there's a lot of uncertainty, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So I think when there's so much ambiguity, so much uncertainty, so much risk, it really makes sense. And this is something that I learned only maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It really makes sense not to make bold decisions, but rather to keep your options open, right? So it's really, really important to make sure that you don't shut the door behind you. Because, hey, if then tomorrow or a year later, the world around you changes, you better be able to maneuver out of where you are, right? So I think keeping your options open or keeping the doors open behind you, there's several ways of putting that lesson, I think is extremely important in this world we're in with so much uncertainty. So that's the second lesson that I think I have learned. And unfortunately, I only learned about it maybe in the last 5 or 10 years that I realized that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Okay. Now, the third,
Okay.
let me give you a third. The third is about courage and it's about determination. So I always like to quote William Faulkner, the great American writer. And he once said, and I quote, in order to swim for new horizons, you have to have the courage of losing sight of the shore. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? That means, in my view, it means you have to essentially leave your comfort zone. If you want to achieve something in life, if you want to be really innovative, if you want to do something that nobody else has done, you need to leave the familiar behind. You need to lose sight of the shore. And that way, then you'll be able to reach, new heights in your life. You'll be able to discover new things. You'll be able to, in other words, reach for the sky. But you've got to have that courage. Because once again, I mean, as human beings, we have this tendency to just stay within the limits of our comfort zone. So I think that if you want to be successful, if you want to accomplish things in life, you really need to lose sight of the shore, as William Faulkner said.
Fantastic. And those are the top three that you've lived your life by, almost kind of like lifelong rules that our audience can then. So, lesson one and lesson three are kind of correlated, right? You say fortune favors the bold. And in that case, you were talking about curiosity. Boldness is an equivalent of being curious. The third lesson had to do with the courage of leaving the shore behind or forgetting the shore. But the second lesson that's interesting that I thought was almost on the along the lines of contrary to one and two and might have misunderstood, where maybe don't be as risk be a little bit risk averse, plan, keep your options open. How does the second one of being more careful, cautious tie into the one of being bold and courageous? It's almost contrary to the other two, would you not say so? Or did you mean to say something else for number two?
That's a great, I think, comment, Nikki. It's really insightful because I think the second one, you're absolutely right, stands as like a counterpoint to the other two. So I would say it's not about being cautious; it's about being smart cautious, right? So it's about, you know, um, understanding that you may feel, or one may feel, very, very sure as to what is the path to be taken, but that when the environment out there surrounding us is so uncertain as it is these days, then you've got to be smart about it. And today you may be convinced that the best path forward is make taking a left turn, and then you do it and you start running in that direction. But if something happens between today and tomorrow that renders that path the wrong one, then you get stuck, right? You're in trouble. So maybe what you need to do is make sure that you have a way to engage in course correction. So I think it is about being cautious. I agree with you, but it's about being cautious in a smart way, recognizing that you really need to have a plan B. You really need to be able to take a few steps back, right, from the direction in which you were going in order to adapt to changing circumstances. So let me just put it this way. I think the other two quotes, the other two lessons, you're right, they're more idealistic, they're more aspirational. This one is a little bit more realistic, right?
Hmm.
But I think in life, you have to strike a balance between idealism and realism. And that when I
And that
say
is
that, of course,
exactly what it is. Yep.
yeah, no, exactly. And the only thing I would add is that I told you earlier, I'm from Spain, and as you know, the most famous book in the Spanish ever written in the Spanish language, and that was a long time ago, 400 years ago, was Don Quixote, right? And as you know, that entire novel is about the clash between idealism and realism, right? So I think that that novel became so famous, not just because it was beautifully written, but also because it really addresses a central conundrum that we all face in life, right? So, what is the right balance between idealism and realism?
And that's, I guess, the ultimate secret to success is those who are able to strike the balance between idealism and realism, those who can be smart, courageous, and bold, yet be cautious and have a plan B. Almost seems oxymoronic, but it's crossing the fine line, or actually walking the fine line and striking that balance. Let's shift gears a little bit. I'd love to hear and have our audience hear about your book, 2030, as an expert in global trends. Please do tell us what you wrote into the book in terms of Spark Notes version. Our audience would love to understand where you think the world is headed, from a currency standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from a digital and technology standpoint. You truly sound like this Renaissance man that knows it all to be able to predict the future. So please do predict the future for our audience today and go into the depths of what some of the key learnings are from the book itself.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that question because I really enjoy providing an answer to it. And look, I think it's clear to most of us that we're going through major transformations. The world in which most of us were born into is disappearing. And the pandemic, of course, has only accelerated that.
Mhm.
And we need to start thinking about where we're going to be in 5 years, in 10 years from now, because otherwise, things are going to catch us by surprise. And as you said in the book, what I try to do is to say, look, you have to pay attention to three kinds of trends, and they come together. So it's population trends, economic trends, and technological trends. So look, by a wide margin, the most important trend of all is women and what women are doing. As you know, women in an increasingly larger number of countries around the world now have better access to education. And when women have better access to education, not just in the US or in Europe, but also in Sub Saharan Africa, then something very important changes, which is that they stay in school. And then some of them or many of them go to college. In the United States, as you know, now there are more women in college than there are men. And when that
Mhm.
happens, then they postpone having their first child. So 3 generations ago, women would have their first child on average at age 16. But now, on average, American women, for example, have their first child when they are 28 or 29. So they have fewer children because they start later. So I think that's actually a good development. But it changes
Mhm.
everything. Because if we have fewer babies, then we have an aging population. We have more people above the age of 60. And then if that happens, then wealth becomes redistributed in the world. So economically, the other big change, of course, is emerging markets. It's China, it's India, it's all of those places around the world that didn't matter 20 years ago, but now they're about to become the largest part of the global economy. And then lastly, technology. Technology is changing the way we shop, the way we study, the way we work with remote work, of course, and also, very importantly, I think, the way we relate to one another. Let me just give you an example. In the United States, right, now up to about 40% of new heterosexual couples meet each other online. 40%,
Mhm.
right? Before, people would go to a bar or people would meet people at work and so on. So, look, things are changing so quickly, driven by population trends, driven by new economic trends, and driven by new technology, that we're going to be in a completely different situation just 5 or 10 years down the road. And I wrote the book as a guide, as a roadmap. I want people to understand where this is taking us. Because once again, unless we grasp that reality of change, it's going to be very difficult for us to be successful.
And what does that entail? It sounds like it entails two different things. One is what's the most important facet of everyone's life, which is money. It looks like it impacts businesses in currency in a way where you were talking about the concept of crypto. I'm not sure if that's what the book covers as well as one of the things that people need to be aware of with the change coming up. And then the second would be cultural adaptation, right? So, like, how does globalization change the geopolitical climate, the economics of it? So, if you were to say you need to be aware that this trend is coming up or these trends are coming up and you need to be more prepared in order to be successful, what does one need to know from those two standpoints, cultural adaptation and currency change, if any?
Yeah, well, essentially, I think we need to change our mindset. So at the end of the day, we're human beings. We're not machines. We're not robots. So we as human beings only adjust to change if we are convinced inside of our heads that we need to change. And as you know, the instinct for most people is to hold on to our old ways, right? Because they have served us
Mhm.
well in the past. We are creatures of habit, right? And this is very frequently mentioned. But more importantly, we find psychological comfort in continuing to do things in the same way that we've done them in the past, in our routines, right? The things that we do every day, time and again. And so it's very rare for people to confront this much change across the board, all over the world, all at once that we're seeing now. And I think that the people who are being left behind, for example, by globalization, by technological change, by the rise of cryptocurrencies and all of these other things that are going on, are precisely those people who are not mentally switching, right? Who are still using the same assumptions as in the past, who are not ready really to embrace this new, situation, this new reality that we have in the world. So once again, I really believe that it all starts with our mindset. And once again, as human beings, I think we are hardwired to resist change because we
Yeah.
always find comfort in whatever served us well in the past, right? And so I think in order to be successful moving forward, we have to overcome that inertia, that feeling of comfort that comes from doing things as we've been doing them all of our lives.
Yeah, anything, change is the only thing in the world that's constant.
Yeah.
And if you are not moving ahead, it's not that you're stopped, you're actually moving backwards. So that's very much so truly the case. Let's go into a little bit of your personal journey again and, the transformation that you've achieved. What would be a couple things or one main thing you'd want young professionals to know who are maybe considering an academic career, or even in the corporate world they're considering to go into a specific field. Is there any professional advice or guidance you'd like to give to some of our young professionals watching the show?
Oh, absolutely. So the first is follow your passion. I'm sure, Nikki, that that's what you did when you decided to become an entrepreneur, a media entrepreneur. Sometimes people tell you, "Oh, don't do this or don't do that because the opportunities are not as big as in this other field." But then you don't like that other field where people are telling you that there are so many opportunities. So I think the first piece of advice I would give is follow your passion. If you're not passionate about what you're doing, then it's going to be really hard for you to be successful, right? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is never think, at least in my experience, never think that if you spend time and effort on your personal life, for example, getting married or having children, don't think that that's going to slow you down. I actually found just the opposite. When I got married, and my wife has always worked the same as I have, she's also an academic, and we had children. Now, of course, that was tougher on her than on me. I realized that. But, both of us were able to continue with our careers. Having children didn't slow us down. You know why? Because you become so much more efficient. You become so much more focused, especially when you've realized, oh my God, I've brought a couple of creatures. We have two daughters into the world. So now things are getting really serious, right? At that point, and that you have to get your act together. You know that you have to cater to their needs because they're completely helpless, right? Babies when they're born, and for many years to come. But at the same time, you want to make progress with your career. So I realize that a lot of people have trouble with that, especially women, because we still don't have the structures to help them. But never, I would say, never think that in order to achieve professional success, you have to put your personal life or your family life on hold. I think that the trick is to look for the synergies between the two, right? How can you be happy about your life because you're pursuing your dreams, to start a family or to be with somebody, and at the same time, pursue your professional goals? And you will see that by focusing on your personal life, you will also become so much more efficient with your professional life. You'll become more focused. You'll get perspective on things, right? And gaining that perspective that comes from trying to navigate all of these complicated issues, that now we call work-family balance, right? Trying to navigate those very difficult issues makes you a better person and makes you, I think, a smarter person.
My gosh, that's a whole different segment on how you can achieve work-life harmony and how a lot of the newer generation is putting becoming parents, or the parenthood journey on hold for this very reason. And you've really shifted the paradigm here by saying it actually should not be on hold. It actually helps you succeed. So that was tremendous, and maybe we can get into it a little bit later, another episode or so. But Thank you so much for that wonderful advice and guidance. And Mauro, is there anything else that you want our audience to know today that we have not covered on our show?
Well, I think you know, the single most important thing is something that you mentioned in passing a few minutes ago, which is that when change is engulfing us, we need to realize that change is the only possible response to change. Because if you remain static, as you said, then you're not really staying in the same place because the world is moving. So you're actually going backwards, right?
Backwards.
So
Yep.
change, exactly. Change is the only possible response to change. But once again, for some reason, we seem to be hardwired to maybe freeze when there's so much change, right? So to hope, we stop, right? Hoping that things are going to go back to normal, perhaps. And you know what? That very rarely happens. So really, what I would like to emphasize is change is the only possible response to change.
And that's the flight or fight syndrome, right? That humans, as we are, you keep saying the word hardwired, we are supposed to do is not just when there's a threat, change can be perceived as a threat. So really, the concept of fear for some folks has two meanings in life. One is, forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. And I think the concept here that we have realized in talking with you is face it and rise above it. With that said, thank you, Mauro. This was a wonderful conversation, and good luck with the book. We look forward to releasing your episode. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me, Nikki. Hello, I'm Mauro Guillén. I'm the Dean of the Business School at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Today I would like to tell you about the future of money. This is a very important topic because, as you know, money plays a central role in the economy. And look at what a famous banker, Mayer Ansel Rothschild, once said, and I quote, "Permit me to use and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." Unquote. Money is central to the economy, but it's also a symbolic thing, and it has major political and geopolitical implications. Money was invented some 7,000 years ago. It's one of just a few innovations that truly changed the world, including the control of fire, the wheel, the domestication of animals, the compass, the printing press. Now, why is money so useful? Money is useful because it reduces the value of everything to one metric. That is to say, it helps us overcome the classic problem of comparing apples to oranges. It also enables calculations across goods and over time. It reduces transaction costs because otherwise we have to use barter, that is to say, to exchange one merchandise for another. It facilitates borrowing and saving, and it helps people plan. Now, not all money is the same. People tend to get rid of something that is called bad money and to keep good money. This is Gresham's law, which was formulated in 1860 by Henry McLeod as, and I quote, "bad money drives out good," unquote. And it's called Gresham's law because Henry McLeod was reflecting on the observations made by Sir Thomas Gresham 300 years earlier. So we use bad money to make payments, but we use good money to store our wealth. So what are the uses of money? So money is a means of exchange. It can be used to make payments or to receive payments. It's also a unit for account. Once again, it helps us compare apples to oranges, so to speak. And it is a store of value. Whenever a family, an individual, a company, or an entire country accumulates a surplus, well, sometimes you keep that surplus in money. You can also keep it, of course, in real estate or in gold. Now, money, if you remember, used to be in the form of coins. oftentimes made of precious metal. But the invention of paper money revolutionized the use of this device in the economy. Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, visited China, and he noticed that paper money was circulating over there. So I'm directly quoting him. All these pieces of paper are issued with as much solemnity and authority as if they were of pure gold or silver, unquote. So paper money was first issued in 1260 by Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. So modern paper money, the kind that we use today on a daily basis, came along in the context of the rivalry between England and France. In 1694, the courtiers of King William suggested an innovation to allow the king to secure the funding, the money that it needed in its wars against France. So what they did was they created a private company by the name of the Bank of England, which took deposits in gold from the public in exchange for a paper receipt. And then those receipts written on a piece of paper would circulate as money, but of course backed up by the gold that had been deposited at the Bank of England. Now, what are the requirements for paper money to work, whether we're talking about China or we're talking about England or any other country in the world? Well, first is trust. Now, people need to trust that piece of paper. Otherwise, it would have no value. It would serve no purpose. The second is that it has to be easy to use, easy to essentially give to somebody else in payment, or easy to receive from somebody else as if we were receiving a payment. And then third, there has to be security around it. It has to be difficult to forge. Let me focus more squarely on the third use of money that we were talking about a moment ago. Money as a reserve currency. So we use reserve currencies to store value. And of course, everybody prefers reserve currencies that are strong, solid, and safe. Now think also there are distinct benefits to whoever it is, a government or somebody else who issues. Now what are those benefits? Well, think for example about the United States, which issues the dollar, which is the world's dominant reserve currency. What are the benefits to the United States of the fact that the dollar has been, since the end of World War II, the dominant reserve currency in the world? Well, it enables Americans and American companies to have lower transaction costs in trade, because most international trade is denominated in US dollars, and that's the currency that Americans have. It also leads to lower interest rates, once again, because people hold the dollar as a store of value. And that essentially means that the US will enjoy lower interest rates because of the demand for dollars. It also gives the United States as a country prestige. It gives it power and influence because you essentially become an indispensable country. Whenever there are discussions or negotiations about global economic or financial matters, the United States needs to be invited. Now, as in the movie Superman, with great power comes great responsibility. So yes, there are benefits to having a reserve currency, but there's also obligations. For example, your currency needs to be convertible, freely convertible in the market. You need to be able to buy and sell dollars freely in the market. Your country, in this case United States, has to agree to free capital flows in and out of the country. Otherwise, people wouldn't want to hold dollars. There has to be rule of law. That is to say, if people or companies or other governments are holding dollars, there has to be a way in which those holders of dollars can defend their interests in court. There has to be a large and liquid market for securities, such as bonds. Why? Well, because people oftentimes don't store their wealth in dollars as a currency, but rather in securities denominated in dollars, such as, for example, treasury bills, those bonds issued by the US Treasury. But pay attention to the last two bullet points on the screen right now. It is also important that government policy making is predictable. Otherwise, people won't trust your currency. Think about how over the last perhaps 10 to 15 years, Policy making in Washington, D.C. has become increasingly more unpredictable. And think about what is the kind of message that you're sending to people around the world who may be interested in holding dollars or using the dollar for international transactions. Well, that's something that in principle undermines their trust in their currency. And then lastly, there's another very important obligation. You have to be, as a country, fiscally responsible. So once again, think about what has been going on in Washington, D.C. for the last 10 or 15 years. That essentially Congress has had a difficult time agreeing as to whether to increase the debt ceiling or agreeing on a budget. So in other words, any hint that a particular country may become more fiscally irresponsible is something that undermines the trust that people have in that currency issued by that government. Now, let me take you on a tour around the world and over time. So 100 years ago, on the eve of World War I, the map that you see on the screen describes the movements of capital. It was very clear that at the time, the United Kingdom was the dominant financial power in the world. Most of the flows of money originated from the UK, and they flowed to Canada, to the United States, to Latin America, to South Africa, to India, to Australia, and to other European countries. By comparison, France or Germany were relatively small as financial powerhouses, and so was the United States at the time. About 50 years, half a century, to the year 1967. You can now see that the United States has replaced the UK as the leading financial powerhouse in the world. Europe at the time was still recovering from World War II, and so was Japan. And how about China? Well, back in 1967, China wasn't even part of the global economy. Now, I would argue 1967 was the high point in terms of American predominance or preeminence in the world of global finance. By the year 2000, the turn of the 21st century, Europe had fully recovered, and it was about as big, if you combined all of the different countries into one, as the United States in terms of the global network of financial flows. Japan was also recovering, or had already recovered from World War II. The latest available data from about a couple of years ago. Then we see that we have four big nodes as of, roughly speaking, the year 2018. United States, the European Union, China, and Japan, with India and Saudi Arabia also becoming increasingly important in this network or financial. So what's going on in the world? What is really affecting all of these changes over time? Well, what's going on is that who is the largest economy, who is the largest trading nation, who's got the largest navy for protection of the trade and of the investments, and who's got the dominant reserve currency has been shifting. So we can begin in the 1830s. We can see that at the time, China was the largest economy. It was a very poor country, but it had a very large population. And when you added everything that those people in China produced at the time, then that was amounted to the largest economy in the world. Post-Civil War here in the United States, so by the 1880s, the United States had become the largest economy. Throughout this period, the UK was the number 2 economy, but never the number 1. World War II, the US became the largest economy in the world. Today, the US remains the largest economy, but within a few years, China will become bigger. Now, when it comes to trade in the 19th century, indisputably, the largest economy in terms of trade was the UK. And nowadays, since about 6 or 7 years ago, China has become the largest trading country. Largest navy, once again, relevant for essentially protecting the trade routes and also protecting whatever international investments a particular country. Well, first, the largest navy in the 19th century was the Royal Navy, followed by the US Navy after World War II. And today, the US Navy continues the largest in the world and the only one that really can project power and influence throughout the globe. And how about then the reserve currency, the dominant one? Remember, this is the currency that individuals, families, companies, entire countries prefer to use when they are trying to store wealth in a safe place. Back in the 19th century, it was pound sterling. And I'm sure that some of you are thinking, what about gold? Well, I'm going to put gold on the table also, because at the time, during the 19th century, the Bank of England put the pound on the gold standard as a way to provide investors with additional reasons to trust the pound. So in other words, although there were some disadvantages in terms of policy-making flexibility, putting the pound on the gold standard meant that the British currency was even safer than without having that connection to gold. The US dollar became the dominant reserve currency in the world, and once again, between 1944 and 1971, the dollar was on the gold standard. You could actually go with a dollar bill to a branch of the Federal Reserve anywhere in the United States, and the bank was obligated to give you the equivalent in gold at a fixed rate. But in 1971, President Nixon, because of mounting deficits, decided to decouple the value of the US dollar from gold. And since then, of course, we have had more currency volatility. Today, well, the dollar continues to be the most important reserve currency. The second most important one is the euro. So look at the last column on the screen, the one on the right-hand side, the situation today. We are going through a transition. There is no one country that dominates all four lines in the table. China is about to become the largest economy. It already is the largest trading nation. But at least for the next 10 or 20 years, I would say, the US will continue to have the largest navy, and the US will continue to provide the world with the centerpiece of the global financial architecture, which is the most important international currency, the US dollar. So this is the greenback. Now the question is, what's going to happen in the future? The US is no longer the largest trading nation. The US at some point will no longer be the largest. In order to illustrate how the dynamic of money works, let me just tell you a little story. So first, let me ask you this very simple question. Imagine that I owe you $10,000 and I offer you two ways of paying you back. One is to give you a personal check of mine written to the order of cash for $1. Okay? The other one, and give you, of course, enough of this to satisfy my debt with you. The other one is to give you pieces of paper such as the one that I just showed you earlier, which is the US dollar, a greenback. Well, I think most of you would tell me, give me cash. But you see, I could give you this personal check of mine. It says payable to the order of cash. Well, yes, but it's not the same to have Uncle Sam, meaning the US government backing up the piece of paper that we know as a greenback, as opposed to myself backing up this piece of paper with my bank account. It could well be that I don't have enough money in my bank account to pay you $10,000. So yes, you have more trust in Uncle Sam. You have more trust in the US government than you would have in any particular individual, including myself. So most of you, I'm sure, if not all of you, would prefer to be paid in greenbacks as opposed to in my personal check. But remember, these two pieces of paper are cash. These two pieces of paper are for $1. It's just that how much trust is behind each of these papers, how trustworthy they are about the individual that you see over here on the screen. Yes, he's a famous painter, Salvador Dalí, from Spain, my home country. That's not the reason why I chose him for this story. The reason that I chose him is because he is the first artist in history to try to make money by selling his brand name, by licensing his brand name. He realized back in the 1960s that he was very famous. He was a very accomplished artist. His paintings were selling at the time for millions of dollars. Today, for tens of millions of dollars. So he realized that he could persuade companies to pay him a fee in exchange for endorsing their products. So in this way, modern licensing was born. And look, this is something that happened back in the 1960s. I'm going to ask you a very important question at the end. So he, the painter, Salvador Dalí, and a whole bunch of friends went to a restaurant in New York in the year 1968. And at the end of the meal, the painter paid with a personal check. He entered the amount for the meal, he signed it, he gave it to the waiter, the waiter gave it to the manager, and the check on its back, endorsed it with his signature, and then sent the check to the bank for deposit. However, that day, remember, Mr. Dalí was very creative, not just as an artist, but also as a business person. He decided to run a little experiment. Before he gave the check to the waiter, he turned it on its back, characteristic of his style. Not only that, he also signed it. And remember, art signed by the artist is actually more valuable. And then he gave the check to the waiter, and the waiter gave the check to the manager. And the manager turned the check on its back, was about to sign it, when he realized that there was this beautiful drawing. Now he realized that Dali was a very famous painter, and that therefore the painting should be worth something. So instead of sending the check to the bank, everybody went back home. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Dali, the painter, was in his apartment in New York, taking a look at his bank statement, and he realized that the money was still in his account because the check, once again, was on the wall of the restaurant. So at that point, he had two thoughts. The first thought was, he said, I'm a genius. But the second thought was, I can print my own money, he said. You see, I don't have to use dollars. I can pay for meals in New York with my own currency. His currency was his art, his drawings. So he went to another restaurant. He repeated the same procedure, and sure enough, the check with a slightly different drawing on the back ended up on the wall. And another restaurant, and so on and so forth. This was going on for weeks. So my question to you is, think about it. Until when do you think that Ali and his friends were able to get away with a free lunch? Let me repeat the question. Until when do you think that Ali and his friends were able to get away with a free lunch? Well, one possible answer is until every restaurant in New York had one of these drawings. Or another potential answer could be until his currency got so devalued because he was printing too much of it, right? And that's essentially what happened. After a few weeks, right, the restaurant managers in New York realized that the painter was attempting to take them for a ride because this was their logic, okay? We have two numbers here that we need to compare. One is the value of the meal, let's say $300, which is on the front side of the check. The other number is the value of the drawing, which is on the reverse side of the check. Well, when the value of the drawing drops below the value of the meal, in this case $300, then it would be perfectly rational for the restaurant managers to deposit the check at the bank. Did that happen? Of course it happened, because Ali kept on printing his own currency. He kept on paying with these drawings. At some point, there were so many of them that the value of each individual drawing fell below the value of the lunch. So this whole scheme came to an end after a few weeks. Unfortunately, none of the checks have survived. Today, perhaps, those drawings, originally done by the artist, each of them unique, perhaps they would be worth much more than that. But at the time, it made sense for the restaurant owners or the restaurant managers to deposit the checks. So what are the lessons from this little story that I just told you? The lesson from this little story is that nothing is forever. That if the country, the central bank, in this case the Federal Reserve, that prints the money that you see on the screen right now, the US dollar, if they go too far, then people will start asking questions about the true value of the piece of paper. People will start losing their trust in this piece of paper. Something really important to consider for the future. So once again, keep in mind, all currencies, whether they are made of metal or they are made of paper, but especially in the latter case, when they're made with paper, they require a very important dose of trust. So what's the situation in the world when it comes to different currencies for reserve purposes? Remember, as a store of value. So here what you see on the chart, we begin in the year 1995 and it goes to the end of 2020. And it's the allocation of reserves by central banks, meaning by governments in the world, by currency. At the top, we have the US dollar. As you can see, 20 years ago, it was at a level of 72% of the total. But as of the end of last year, it's only about 59%. The euro first went up and then came down, and is currently at a level of only 21%. And then at the bottom, we have other currencies, such as pound sterling, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, and the Chinese renminbi, which has started to be used as an international currency for reserve purposes during the fourth quarter of the year 2016. So China may be the world's largest trading nation. China may be the next big economy in the world, over becoming bigger than the United States within a few years. But as you can see, very few governments in the world still trust the renminbi enough to allocate their reserves in that currency. The same goes for individuals, for families, or for companies. So the renminbi has a long way to go in terms of building that trust. Now, some people say that the gap that you see over here in the chart between the dollar and the renminbi, which is not proportional to the importance of these two economies, meaning the US is not 60 or 59% of the global economy, and certainly the United States doesn't account for 59% of global trade. And remember, China is now a bigger trading nation. What this gap seems to indicate is that there's an opportunity for other currencies. We have cryptocurrencies. Now remember, the basic idea behind Bitcoin is that there is a computer algorithm that controls how much Bitcoin is issued. And as a result, then people should trust this cryptocurrency because the algorithm is not a government. It will never overspend. It will only increase the supply of Bitcoin at a predetermined rate. The famous economist Milton Friedman once said that he would like to replace the Fed, the Federal Reserve, with a computer. Well, in a way, Bitcoin is exactly that. It was launched on October 31st, 2008, by somebody presumably called Satoshi Nakamoto, although nobody really knows exactly who did this, when he uploaded a paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It really changed the world as we know it by proposing a robust network in which participants, and I quote from the paper, vote with their CPU, central processing unit power, expressing their acceptance of valid blocks. Any needed rules and incentives can be enforced within this consensus mechanism, unquote. In other words, it is a completely autonomous currency, not controlled by any centralized authority, such as a government or a central bank. Now, Nakamoto argued that financial intermediaries would no longer be needed if we could operationalize the entire system behind the currency on a network of computers. That network of computers would be the home for a very important thing, the blockchain. The blockchain was a new technology designed as a system to verify Bitcoin transactions. Now, what is the blockchain? The blockchain is just essentially blocks of data that are linked to one another in a chain. It is a decentralized ledger with records that cannot be changed. So it just tells you at any given point in time who owns a particular piece of Bitcoin. It assumes that the counterparties in every transaction neither know each other nor have trust in each other. Listen to that carefully. So, in principle, it is a system that doesn't require trust. Each block in the blockchain follows the rules established by the first block in the chain. And then the so-called miners, which are essentially people working at a computer, verify transactions and concatenate or link the blocks to one another. So what does this mean in practice? Well, in practice, what it means, presumably in principle, is that it's extremely safe. So let me quote from a recent book of mine, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. In that book, I write, and I quote, "The odds of guessing a winning Powerball number is 1 in 292 million. The probability of hacking a Bitcoin private key is a minuscule 1 in 2 to the 256th power, which is 1 in over 115, and let's see if I can pronounce this word, quattuorvigintillion, which is a number with 78 digits. That's because the encryption technique uses a 256-bit key on switches that can be either on or off, hence the number 2. The resulting odds are astronomically low, and they are equivalent to winning the Powerball 9 times in a row. So that's why people believe there are other issues with Bitcoin. Regulatory problems. Remember what Rothschild said, the banker. What he said was that issuing or controlling money is actually far more important than being able to pass laws, right? Whoever controls money in a country controls everything. So in other words, no government, no central bank is going to allow something like Bitcoin to become very large or very important. Why? Because they will want to continue having control over the currency. The dollar in the United States, the renminbi in China, the euro in Europe. Also taxation, right? So governments will seek to tax, and I think that could hinder the growth of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Third point, governments, central banks, they don't want to lose control over monetary policy. Remember, in 2008, at the time of the global financial crisis, or more recently, during the coronavirus pandemic, it was the Federal Reserve who bailed us out from the worst of the economic recession. You don't want to lose control over monetary policy. Now remember also, inflation is taxation without representation. That's why people don't like inflation. And it is not clear that cryptocurrencies won't lead to inflation. Also, the proliferation of cryptocurrencies could represent a threat to the banking system. Governments, of course, will lose or would lose their ability to inflate their debt away, that is to say, to print money in order to pay for the interest or the principal on the bonds that they have issued in the past. And governments, central banks, will also lose the possibility of devaluing their currency to be more competitive in international trade. Remember, many countries in the world do just that. If they want to make their exports more competitive, what they do is they devalue their currency, so that when people from other parts of the world purchase their goods and services. Now, there are different types of cryptocurrencies. Centralized versus decentralized. So Bitcoin is a decentralized cryptocurrency. But, we could have centralized cryptocurrencies issued by an authority. For example, it could be a government itself. There are plans by the Chinese central bank to launch a digital renminbi. And I strongly suspect that the Federal Reserve of the United States would follow suit with the launching of a digital dollar. There are peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies. Once again, Bitcoin will be an example of that. Now, biggest objection that I have about cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of electricity, a lot of power to have the network in place and verify the transactions on Bitcoin. The carbon footprint of all of that computing power needed to verify Bitcoin transactions, believe it or not, is actually equivalent to the annual carbon footprint of an entire country such as Denmark, with several billion people in it. So this raises a serious issue. There's also electronic waste. There's so many negative environmental side effects from the use of this blockchain technology for the purpose. Now, let me also offer you, in closing here, some statistics about Bitcoins. As I told you earlier, the supply of Bitcoins has been growing very, very slowly because the algorithm limits the amount of Bitcoin that is printed. And once again, this is in principle what should persuade people to have trust in the currency, that it's never going to be subject to the kind of negative effect that we saw with the story about Dali. Now, why does the price of Bitcoin fluctuate so much, which is what you can observe on this chart, especially since the year 2018? Well, because given that the supply only grows in very tiny increments, then the price of Bitcoin in the market is determined by the demand, by how many people want to hold Bitcoin. And as you know, the demand for Bitcoin goes up, but then comes down, because people essentially haven't figured out yet how valuable Bitcoin is and how much trust they should have in it. And as you can see, the price can fluctuate by 100%, by 200%. Now, the market capitalization, the value of all Bitcoin in circulation, that is, also goes up and down, remember, depending on the price. This may be one of the biggest reasons why we still see that cryptocurrencies account for such a small percentage of all payment methods. So what you see here in the table is the percentage of people around the world using each of these methods as of the end of 2019. Credit cards, electronic payments, debit cards, in that order, are still the most widely used payment methods in the world. Cryptocurrency is nowhere near. So what's my forecast, right? So remember, we are getting into a very complicated period in history in which we're going to have a lot of turmoil in the world as we see China rising and the United States trying to hold on to its position in the global economy. We're going to see a lot of turmoil as well in currency markets. I believe that governments will end up issuing cryptocurrency. Why? Because they don't want to lose control over monetary policy. I believe that other cryptocurrencies, such as, for example, Bitcoin, will succeed, but only if they become much more than just currency. I think the future lies in smart contracts, that is to say, electronic contracts, where the different clauses are automatically triggered depending on which conditions are met. I think there's also scope for incorporating not just smart contracts, but also discount coupons, pro-social incentives, such as, for example, those that encourage us to economize on energy, or even voting rights, not just in political elections, but also perhaps at companies, among shareholders who have to vote on various measures that the company is trying to adopt. So I believe that the future will probably be about bundling. The future will be about currencies, cryptocurrencies for sure, but also smart contracts, discount coupons, pro-social incentives, voting rights, all becoming part of what I normally call digital tokens. I think that would be innovative. I think that would be a creative solution to some of our problems. I think it would reduce transaction costs. How can we make cryptocurrencies work in the near future? Well, once again, they cannot simply be a substitute for legal tender. They should actually transform the way in which individuals and companies think about money and use money. And they should open up new horizons and possibilities, not only in business or personal finance, but also in terms of improving our quality of life. So once again, an example would be to reduce transaction costs and at the same time encourage certain desirable behaviors that contribute to the common good, such as reducing the carbon footprint, reducing urban congestion, protecting endangered species, improving the relationship between the citizen and its government, protecting intellectual property, or even registering and tracking firearms. Think about what the CEO of Coinbase, one of the most important operators in the world of cryptocurrencies, said about a couple of years ago, and I quote, "Our mission is to create an open financial system for the world. We believe open protocols for money will create more innovation, economic freedom, and equality of opportunity, just like the internet did for publishing information," unquote. So once again, like with information being published on the internet, there are a lot of benefits, but there are also some costs, some downsides. Remember the phenomenon of fake news, for example. I think the same is true in the case of cryptocurrencies. They can be a force for good, but they can also, for example, undermine the ability of governments to engage in monetary policy in the middle of a crisis. So that's why I believe the future is not just cryptocurrencies. The future is bundles of financial products that I will call digital tokens that will include cryptocurrency as well as many other things, such as, for example, smart contracts. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm putting on the screen my contact information. Please find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. And that way we can continue to be in touch with one another. You can update me about what's going on your side. And I frequently post videos and other material on it, so you can also see what I'm up to. Thank you so much for your attention today, and I hope you have enjoyed this mini presentation on the future of money and currencies.
Thank you for joining us today and elevating yourself. Charity should begin at home, but should not stay there. At 180 Elevate, it is our honor to support local and global philanthropies which make an impact on the lives of our beautiful children and the world in of itself.
What would this world look like if we all felt cared for? Let's co-create that new paradigm. If you would like to consider joining our philanthropic mission, please consider donating at 180elevate.com. And next is just a glimpse into one of the many philanthropies our organization supports.
नीचे लेके जाने के बाद तो मैं पूरा लाइटिंग वगैरह था और मैं समझ नहीं पा रही थी कि ये क्या है।
कौन सी तेरी एज क्या थी जब?
तभी मैं 12 साल की हो गई।
She got trafficked at a very young age. Yeah, so got trafficked by her aunt and her uncle.
वो तेरा शुक्रिया अदा कर रहे थे, को बोल रहे कि बहुत बहुत थैंक यू कि तू यहाँ पर आई है और अपनी स्टोरी शेयर कर रही, कि तेरी स्टोरी से बहुत सारे दूसरे लड़कियाँ भी बच सकती हैं।
वेलकम।
She was being forced to dance in a dance bar by her uncle initially. Then the aunt had taken money from one of the customers to rape Manisha.
कुछ ऑप्शन ही नहीं था। मैंने वही समझ लिया था कि यही है मेरी ज़िंदगी। उस समय जो मतलब सपोर्ट चाहिए था वो
Every day think that somebody from my family will come and release me, but nobody came ever.
In the sex trade, every girl has a shelf life. Until she is a teenager, her cost, her value is super high. As soon as her age deteriorates and she becomes older, she moves down the ladder, and the moment she turns 30, she's on the streets. Most of the time she's on her own.
I knew in my heart that every one of these girls is bigger than any moment of exploitation, any moment of brutality that she has gone through, just like we are bigger than any moment or any obstacle that has passed in our lives. I quit my job and moved into a broken down hotel room in Asia and went undercover into trafficking networks to find these girls.
We have rescued more than 100 girls from this area with close to 25 rescues altogether.
तो उन्होंने भी लाइक वैसा ही मेरे जो मैं फील कर रही थी उस समय, उन लोग ने भी वही सोच लिया था कि उनका भी वही है लाइफ।
In 2013, she got rescued from one of the bar in Dombivli, and that was the time when, her fate changed.
And she went on from rescuing her own sister to rescuing many dozens more. And so all those girls' lives changed because of that. And all those girls have the possibility and the potential to become like Manisha has become.
Today, my organization has intelligence on over 800 child sex traffickers that are currently raping, selling, and exploiting young girls. And we are on the precipice of taking massive action to take out these networks and save over 6,000 girls from child sex trafficking.
मेरे अंदर इसके लिए जगह मुझे बहन के बाद ये फीलिंग आई कि मुझे दूसरे को भी रेस्क्यू करने के बाद ऐसा ही वो फील दिलाना है.
But Manisha's story, the way that she rescued her sister, is the same story for every single one of our donors, because they're rescuing somebody else's sister. And so we can all be Manisha when we take the courage to do what she did, which for a donor is just getting involved with our organization and inspiring freedom for another person.
मेरा सपना है मेरे भी बहन के लिए, मुझे जो बनना था मैं तो बन गई क्योंकि लोग मेरे साथ हैं. मेरा सपना अभी फ़िलहाल ये है कि मेरा 10th कंप्लीट करना है, उसके बाद जो भी आगे का ट्रेनिंग होगा सोशल वर्कर का. मेरे लिए सोशल वर्कर का मतलब ये है कि मैं किसी को मैं बचा रही हूँ, क्योंकि मुझ जैसा भी लाइफ कोई जी रहा है. आई वॉन्ट हेल्प अदर पीपल, अदर गर्ल्स.